Paul projected a 30% profit margin. Within months, every dollar of his liquidity was gone. The house survived. His capital did not. This collapse did not begin with a market crash. It began with a signature. The air inside the empty property was dense, carrying the faint scent of damp wood. Paul, 42, stood in the center of the living room, feeling winter cold seep through his shoes. He did not look at the hairline fractures in the plaster or the subtle sag in the oak floorboards. His focus was fixed on the glowing screen of his tablet. In a ruthless market, speed was currency. To win the bidding war, friction had to disappear. He dragged his stylus across the glass, legally waiving his right to a structural inspection. It was not reckless. It was competitive. It had worked before. He believed he was securing an asset, but a spreadsheet cannot carry structural weight. With one rational signature, Paul anchored his liquidity to a deteriorating structural mass, already failing inside its own walls. The math was flawless. The foundation was not. Welcome to the Financial Autopsy. We do not analyze success, we dissect collapse. Real estate is widely worshipped as a passive monument of wood and equity, a stable store of value immune to emotion. It is not. A house is a physical system. It consumes capital whether you acknowledge it or not. In accelerated markets, investors are trained to remove friction. Due diligence becomes delay, inspection becomes hesitation. Paul was a veteran of that velocity. He understood one rule: the fastest signature wins. He bought the zip code, the projected margin, and the aesthetic upside. He did not realize he had also inherited structural decay. This autopsy does not begin with a recession or external shock. It begins inside a load-bearing wall. The file is now open. The foundation is already compromised. The keys rested heavy in his coat pocket. Paul stood in the center of the living room, listening to the expensive silence of his new acquisition. The air was stale, holding a faint metallic chill that settled deep into the floorboards. To him, the empty structure was not a physical place. It was a three-dimensional container for capital. The walls represented equity. The dusty windows framed a projected margin. There was no risk visible in the pale afternoon light, only the quiet, compressed anticipation of a profitable timeline. The acquisition had been surgical. In a market where hesitation was mathematically punished, Paul had deployed a tactic he had perfected over a decade of successful flips. He stripped the friction from his offer by waiving the structural inspection. It was a calculated risk, a documented competitive advantage that allowed him to bypass institutional buyers and secure the asset in under 48 hours. The spreadsheet confirmed a comfortable margin, even if minor cosmetic repairs exceeded initial projections. The math rewarded his speed. Within days of closing, the controlled ascent of the project began. Capital flowed precisely as the model dictated. The cosmetic demolition crews arrived with military punctuality, stripping away the outdated surfaces to prepare the property for its modern rebirth. Paul orchestrated the movement of funds from his liquid reserves into the physical renovation with absolute confidence. The asset appeared perfectly obedient. The superficial drywall was removed, the debris was hauled away, and the operational rhythm of the site pulsed with profitable efficiency. The structure was silent, but the house was hungry. Paul was managing the baseline cost of the renovation flawlessly. He operated under the assumption that the property was a static, passive object, waiting to be upgraded and sold. His daily burn rate was optimized, allocating funds to aesthetic enhancements, premium fixtures, imported tiles, and high-end staging that would maximize the final valuation. He was playing a sophisticated game of financial leverage on top of physical matter, trusting the theoretical numbers on his screen more than the tactile reality of the wood and stone beneath his feet. Yet, behind the newly framed partitions and the neatly stacked materials, an invisible pressure was mounting. The house was not a static monument. It was a complex, aging organism. While the surface was being aggressively polished, the dark, unexamined cavities of the infrastructure remained sealed. Paul's confidence acted as a blindfold. He had purchased the zip code and the floor plan, completely unaware that he had also assumed liability for a structural decay that was quietly existing in the dark. The schedule was ruthlessly lean. The cosmetic upgrades were ahead of time, and the capital deployment was tracking perfectly against the initial projections. Every decision Paul had made thus far was defensible, intelligent, and widely applauded by his peers. He had built a flawless financial machine, but he had anchored it to a fragile, untested earth. He was entirely in control. The structure disagreed. The third week of renovation brought a heavy, relentless rain. Inside the property, the ambient temperature dropped sharply, and the trapped air grew thick. The faint, sweet smell of damp wood that Paul had briefly registered on day one began to aggressively permeate the first floor, clinging to the newly delivered stacks of premium drywall. He walked through the site, his heavy boots echoing against the bare subfloor, consciously ignoring the subtle, spongy give beneath his heel. The physical mass of the structure was beginning to assert itself against the theoretical lightness of his business plan. Paul sat in his idling SUV outside the property, the heater humming quietly, the stark blue light of his laptop illuminating his focused expression. His financial model was a masterpiece of operational efficiency. The daily burn rate was tracking exactly as projected, and his allocated capital was smoothly transitioning into perceived physical equity. He reviewed the expensive line items for the kitchen island and the imported lighting fixtures, feeling the deep, intoxicating validation of a master operator. The numbers on the screen were clean, obedient, and perfectly aligned with his intended timeline. The spreadsheet was a flawless simulation of success. The physical weather outside did not care. As the initial demolition phase transitioned into the deep, rough-in work, the mechanical vibration of the heavy power tools sent deep tremors through the old joists. The house was being actively pushed, forced to immediately adapt to the aggressive, unforgiving pace of a modern flip. Paul's crew, operating strictly under his mandate of maximum velocity, worked with clinical precision. But a house is not a digital asset that can be reprogrammed. It is a rigid organism of wood, nails, and settling earth. When placed under sudden, immense operational stress, hidden fractures do not heal. They simply widen. The first visible fracture in the timeline occurred on a Tuesday morning. The lead contractor pulled Paul aside before the heavy work began. He pointed an industrial flashlight toward the base of a central plaster-covered wall separating the kitchen from the main living area. He noted that the baseboard felt soft, and the drywall dust was clinging to unexplainable moisture. Paul looked at the wall, then looked at his watch. He mentally categorized the observation as a minor variance, instructing the crew to proceed with the planned open-concept demolition. The decision to push forward was entirely rational within the rigid context of his model. Stopping meant halting the timeline, delaying subcontractors, and increasing the daily carrying costs. In Paul's mind, the wall was just another physical obstacle to be removed, a simple, calculable equation of labor and disposal fees. He did not feel the dense, cold reality gathering tightly behind the plaster. The oxygen in his financial structure was still plentiful, but the atmosphere inside the house was rapidly thinning. The crew positioned their equipment around the central partition. Paul stood quietly in the doorway, ready to watch his lucrative open-concept vision materialize. The sledgehammers were raised in unison. The physical barrier between his projected wealth and his actual liability was about to be breached. He believed he was merely opening a room to increase the property value. He had no idea he was about to open a vein. The heavy steel of the sledgehammer met the plaster. A dry, hollow crack echoed through the empty ground floor, followed by a dense cascade of dust. As the crew pulled the first large section of the wall away, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The ambient temperature seemed to drop, and the faint, sweet smell of damp wood suddenly sharpened into the unmistakable, suffocating stench of deep, ancient rot. The contractor stepped back, lowering his tool. The rhythmic, expensive noise of the renovation ceased entirely. Paul stepped forward, his boots crunching over the fallen debris. Behind the cosmetic facade, the dark cavity of the house was exposed. The main load-bearing studs were black and spongy, heavily compromised by years of invisible water intrusion from a failed exterior line. The wood literally crumbled under the light pressure of the contractor's gloved hand. The damage did not stop at the floorboards. It tracked downwards, deep into the primary structural supports of the property. The house was not resting on a solid foundation. It was standing on a decaying sponge. In that quiet, dusty moment, the vector of Paul's financial reality permanently altered. The property immediately ceased to be a vehicle for valuation and equity. It transformed into a massive, heavy liability demanding immediate triage. The spreadsheet in his car was now a work of fiction. Every projected margin evaporated into the damp air, replaced by the brutal physical requirement of structural survival. He could no longer upgrade the asset. He first had to stop it from collapsing. The illusion of control was gone. The house had taken over. The fracture is now visible. The environment has permanently shifted the risk exposure. Submit your structural diagnosis below. What is the fundamental error in Paul's operational architecture? The timeline now narrows. The contractor handed Paul a revised estimate. It was not a bill for aesthetic improvement. It was a ransom note for structural survival. The foundational rot extended beneath the kitchen floor and into the primary support beams. The original cosmetic budget was instantly obsolete, swallowed by the immediate need for steel jacks, temporary shoring, and extensive wood replacement. The house was no longer a canvas for profit. It was a patient on life support. Paul retreated to the cold leather seat of his SUV. The stark blue light of his laptop illuminated his face against the descending winter evening. He stared at the spreadsheet, running the brutal calculations of his new reality. He faced a distinct mathematical intersection. He could halt the project, list the compromised property immediately, and absorb a painful, realized loss of $50,000. Or he could defend his initial projection, fortifying the foundation to save the anticipated profit margin. He chose to defend the margin. It was a rational decision based on past victories and an absolute refusal to fail. To keep the project alive, Paul logged into his primary banking portal and initiated a massive wire transfer. He drained his personal emergency cash reserves, his financial oxygen, and injected it directly into the property's operational account. The keystrokes were silent. The decision was irreversible. He had tied his actual survival to the survival of the rotting wood. The house drank the capital, and it kept asking for more. Specialized foundation crews replaced the cosmetic contractors. The visible progress of the renovation halted entirely, while the entirety of Paul's liquid wealth was buried underground, poured into the dark, damp crawl spaces where no future buyer would ever see it. The structure demanded heavy steel and treated lumber just to remain upright. The daily burn rate continued to tick upward, but the timeline stretched endlessly into the future. Weeks bled into months. The physical environment inside the property grew colder as winter deepened. The initial scent of wet decay was replaced by the sterile metallic smell of fresh concrete and industrial epoxy. Paul's spreadsheet was no longer a tool of control. It was a real-time monitor of a slow hemorrhage. The fixed costs, taxes, insurance, and short-term loan interest did not pause while the foundation was being rebuilt. Then the liquidity dried up. The operational account reached zero before the foundation was complete. 80% reinforced, 20% exposed. The final invoice arrived unpaid. The machinery was removed first, then the crews. The smell of fresh concrete settled into the cold air, and the room stood unfinished, upright, silent. Paul sat on an exposed beam in the center of the living room. No drywall, no staging, no projected margin left to defend. He listed the property exactly as it stood. The offer came quickly, efficient, aggressive. He signed the transfer documents on a temporary folding table, the pen dragging slowly across unfinished wood as the keys changed hands. The structure survived. His liquidity did not. He stepped out into the freezing night and closed the door behind him. The architecture remained. His did not. The autopsy of Paul's financial structure reveals a fatal miscalculation of mass and velocity. His core assumption was that speed inherently creates value. In an effort to eliminate friction and dominate a competitive transaction, he waived the structural verification of a physical entity. He treated a complex, aging structural mass of wood and earth as a purely mathematical abstraction on a spreadsheet. The structural fracture did not occur when the contractor opened the wall. The fracture occurred the moment the ink dried on the inspection waiver. He did not buy a passive asset. He legally assumed a failing structural mass. The amplification mechanism of this collapse was the sudden conversion of paper equity into emergency cash. He mistook a consuming structure for a productive one. A true asset generates cash flow autonomously. Paul's property acted as a parasite. It demanded an immediate massive influx of capital simply to maintain its physical form. By skipping the diagnostic phase, he blinded himself to the hidden operational costs, anchoring his rigid financial model to a foundation that was actively turning to dust. When the structural reality shattered the theoretical margin, Paul committed the final error. Instead of amputating the infected limb and accepting a localized loss, he deployed his liquid oxygen to fight a losing battle against gravity. He drained his war chest, the very cash reserves designed to keep his financial structure breathing, and buried it in the dark, damp crawl space beneath the floorboards. He sacrificed his personal financial sovereignty to subsidize a rotting structure. Paul's collapse was not triggered by volatility, it was triggered by exhaustion. The physical environment is indifferent to ambition. It does not reward aggressive tactics built over structural decay. The most dangerous obligations in any financial architecture are the ones never formally negotiated, the hidden liabilities embedded in the foundation itself. Gravity does not negotiate with projections. The empty rooms of the property eventually found a new owner. The drywall was patched, the cold floors were sealed, and the heavy silence returned to the structure, completely undisturbed by the liquid capital it had quietly consumed. Case closed. The autopsy identified the fracture. The environment will test it again. The F.A.R. system, Financial Autopsy Resilience, was developed as a structural response model to the vulnerabilities examined in this file. Documentation is archived below. Collapse repeats patterns. Defensive architecture remains procedural.